All right, guys. Well, welcome back. This today's video is going to be about it's going to be commentary on someone else's commentary. So, I came across this YouTube channel, a few weeks ago, and I thought these guys are pretty interesting, and a lot of their opinions are, pretty close to mine, pretty much in line. Obviously these guys know the game of bowling, and have a lot of respect for what they have to say and what they bring to the table in regards to their commentary. So, I'm just going to make this a short video. Hopefully, it won't be too long. But they had some, pretty good topics. It's in regards to the PBA tournament this past week, combined with the exhibition event, the USA versus the world, which was pretty interesting. I didn't care for it just because it doesn't have any gravitas to it at all. There's no impact to it. It's not the Ryder Cup, and I understand that they're trying to create that level of excitement, create that level of personal investment that the Ryder Cup has. For bowling, I don't know. I don't know what's going to take for them to recreate that. We did have that, many years ago with the Tournament of Champions in regards to, the respect that event had. I mean, yeah, that was a regular tour event. It wasn't an exhibition match. It was only 52 bowlers, and it was all champions of the PBA Tour. However, it was a unique event, and it had its place in history, and somehow I don't know whose fault it was. I really don't care at this point. It doesn't matter. But it just doesn't have the same impact of what it had, in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. Um, Anyways, so I'll move on, from that. So yeah, so this podcast, sweep the rack. Again, I have a lot of respect for what these guys, for their comments and their opinions, and for their insight, into the sport, which I think is very important. I think that's one way that we're going to be able to grow the sport is by having people like this, that provide insight into the sport. For many years, we've had, these, these telecasts, whether it was PBA or PWBA or Team Challenge, back in the 90s, that was pretty popular, as far as being televised and, watching some highly competitive bowling. It seems like this trend, or not this trend, but it seems like this opinion that, oh, we just have to educate the viewers. This thing about educating the viewers is just it's ridiculous. I mean, the viewers that people don't watch sports to be educated. Yeah, there may be some side stories or whatever about the player or about the manager or about the team, and stuff like that. But you really don't see that in other sports. It's like, well, hey, this is how you keep from slicing the ball. You don't see that during the Masters. Um, and maybe I really don't watch a lot of tennis, but I can't remember watching a tennis, professional tennis. I think they call it the ATP. You see, I don't even watch it. So, anyways, but the last time I have watched it or come across it, I don't see any tips, as far as your equipment or how to play a, certain condition or a pattern. Yeah, in golf, I'm sorry, but in tennis there are different surfaces, and maybe there's a little bit different strategies, or maybe a little difference in what shoes you wear if you're on clay or grass or hard court, whatever. Anyways, my point is that I really got way off the, way I went off on a tangent here. Um, stop with the education, on a professional bowling show. Just stop. You're not going to grab more viewers. The problem with bowling is not, lack of education on a professional, on a professional show. That's not the problem. So, anyways, let me kind of get into it here. Um, I'll post a link, to these guys, in their, this particular episode, and obviously with that, you can find their channel and follow them. I think they have valuable commentary to what's going on in the sport of bowling. So I definitely do appreciate it. So let me get this started here. Make sure that I'm starting in the right spot. So, anyways, so their first thing that they're talking about here is about guys getting along. On the
Bowl TV.
on the just guys getting along in general. You see all these hugs and whatever, and all these guys just getting along on tour. I'm not a big fan of it. I was, back in my day, if you want to call it jealousy or envy, whatever you want to call it. I supported my guys, like guys that I travel with or whatever, you know, I would support them, if they needed something like, hey, go grab this bag, or hey, especially if I'm not bowling and, they're in the finals or whatever, I would help them out, but the other guys there, I'm not sitting there giving them giving these guys a hug. I just don't understand that. Whatever. I know that we live in a different era. We see it. We see it in baseball. I'm a big MLB fan, and um, yeah, we see it in baseball now. Where a lot of these guys know each other. I think it's a different environment, obviously, with the salaries or with the contracts that are involved. I understand why in baseball, a lot of these guys, they're pretty friendly with each other, and you'll see them on the field, kind of give them a little tap on the ass, or a hug, or just a quick little, fist bump hug type of thing, or whatever. It's different. It's different. However, in bowling, maybe because it's personal to me, I see it differently. I'm not interested, in giving some guy a hug. If it's kind of like at the end of an event, it's I don't know, maybe just kind of like a, where you kind of do the handshake, and you kind of do whatever they call that, the overlap, and kind of little, a little bump on the back kind of thing. It's like, yeah, I kind of get that, whatever. I just I hear what these guys are saying, about getting along. So let me play a little bit of what their commentary was, about
Bowl
it.
for some of that to come out in the competition, and these guys still be able to get along off the lanes. Or maybe they shouldn't care if they get along off the lanes. Maybe that's what Born to Bowl is showing. I think based on what we've seen in Born to Bowl, people are going to be surprised in a couple of weeks when the doubles tournament rolls around. I'll say that. So yeah, maybe they need to care less.
So I think what they're referencing here may be wrong. I would have to really see the context of what they're talking about in regards to that, that little mini series Born to Bowl. I know, and there's a little bit of chirping going back and forth on. I think I was on the second episode with Simo. I'm not sure. I think that's just what he was referencing.
About that, right? So I like it. I like it. I like this episode, but I liked at the end when they all spoke about wanting to be the best and wanting to take EJ out, and respecting him and being cool with him, but at the same time, Kyle Troop said it, sort of being jealous of him in a way, because he's the top dog. And I just like that aspect of it. I like it a lot. I thought that was an interesting little window
Well,
into.
yeah, this is a really really good point by Big Mike. He did point out that Kyle, had aspirations of taking out EJ, wanting to become the number one bowler, and that's what you want, especially from the guys that are visible, and from guys that are on the show, hopefully, more often, as far as Kyle goes, and he wants to, he wants to be out there and he wants to be on the show and beat the number one bowler. Everybody wants that. They want to beat the number one, and it doesn't matter what sport it is. So that was a good point. And
what goes on out there.
I agree.
So if you're on tour as a full-time tour and you're a top whatever player, and it doesn't bother you to see EJ Tackett every year getting a player of the year, then you probably shouldn't be a full-time any kind of professional athlete, like competitor.
Yeah, exactly what Brooklyn Rob was saying. It's like, if you're not trying to be number one, just go home. I mean, really, if you're not, if you don't think you have the ability, or if you're not trying to be number one, just go home. Yeah, I agree with Brooklyn Rob on this one.
Right. It should bother Belmonte. It should bother Kyle. It should bother all these guys that are bowling every week. And if it doesn't bother them, Mike, then they should. They're in the wrong profession. And yes, like you could be cordial, right? You could, you're not going to, or maybe not be cordial. I mean,
yeah, it's a good point, about being cordial. I think if you watch some of the old shows from 70s and 80s, these guys, they just did a handshake. I think the one few time that maybe you saw a hug was, maybe Don Johnson's 299, or, I don't even know if any of the players gave Pete McCordick a hug after his perfect game at, at Gable House. But, I'd have to look back. But again, it's one thing to be cordial and kind of, nod your head and, and say, way to go. I think their overall point, what they're trying to get to is, maybe all the hugging's getting a little out of hand here. It doesn't show as like true competitive desire. It just looks like you're okay with just being there. And you know what? Fans don't want to see that. Fans don't want to see someone that's just okay. It's like, oh, hey, I finished third. Let me give this guy a hug. Fans don't want to see that. They want to see that burning desire to win. That's why people followed Marshall Holman. It's why people later on in PDW's career, where kind of had that image, whatever that image is. Fans want to see some red ass. They want to see someone get upset. They want to see someone, have that fire to beat the competitor. And I think kind of what we're seeing right now, on the show, on the PBA show, the hugging may be a little much. I don't know. But it's just something to think about, especially as an individual, as an individual sport that bowling is. You have to have that desire to just, to beat the other guy, whether that guy's your traveling roommate, or you're actually live with them, back home, as a roommate, or or maybe you guys own a pro shop together, or own something else together. You gotta have that desire, to want to beat the guy. And, even if that is a good friend and you beat him, and if you just give him a handshake, that friend, he's going to understand. It's like, oh, hey, he didn't give me a hug after this game. If he's your buddy, he understands, because that buddy of yours, he wanted to beat you as bad. So just, anyways, it's just something to think about. So I'm going to kind of move forward here. I'm going to go to at the 21-minute mark. This is in regards to scoring. So let me see see if I can kind of play into the context a little bit.
I did think it was a competitive show, and there was some really good bowling, and it was entertaining from a bowling sense. I'm not really have any expectations past that these days. I've kind of made that clear a few weeks ago.
No doubt. All right, let's move into the actual tournament from this week. Okay. First thing I would like to talk about in general across the board before we get into the finals and giving our rundown is the scores. I mean, I kind of think that was the story this week. Was it not? I mean, outside of Spencer Robar's winning his first title and the last match there being a really good match.
Yeah, leading up to this tournament, scores were already high. I mean, just crazy. Just they were incredibly high leading up to this. I mean, a U.S. Open. I don't even know what the averages were. I have to look it up again. That's not a U.S. Open, for two reasons. Number one, the scoring pace. Like, what the hell are you thinking? In regards to scoring pace. I mean, truly, what the hell are you thinking? Your job is to grow the sport. And obviously your job, Tom Clark, et al. Whatever. Your job is to grow the sport. And by putting on, everybody knows the U.S. Open is supposed to be a difficult, week. Supposed to be a lot of games on difficult conditions, and that is what the U.S. Open is supposed to be. And that's not what we had this year. So kind of leading up to what we saw. Well, let me go back to the U.S. Open. It's supposed to be an open event, and this one had like a qualifier, had a they ran some rabbit squads, or I believe. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was not a true open event. I understand you can't have 800 people bowling, but as far as what I remember, this used to be a 400 plus entry event, and this thing had a PTQ. It's like, okay, that's no longer an open event. It's just like these people that are putting all this together, they're just making shit up as they go along. This isn't an open. Tournament of Champions is no longer Tournament of Champions. It's just frustrating to watch. So anyways, well, go back to scoring. So
I think that the story from this week was the scores. You had Frankie setting the 6-game and 12-game scoring record. You had Ryan Barnes setting the average record for an overall event. So scores were through the roof this week, higher than we have seen. And I feel like that has been the trend this year. I feel like scores have been consistently up and consistently high this year. Some might say high to the point where it gets a little bit silly. And by that, I mean, it's sort of comes down to who can carry and who can't.
It's beyond a carry contest. I mean, they might as well stick in the M80 in the thumb hole or one of the holes and throw it down there and, have it explode at the pins, and then just have another, have your ball rep come over and give you another ball and stick another piece of dynamite in there. That's where we're at. I mean, it's just, between the pattern and the pin carry and, how strong the balls are, they just made a mockery of the sport. And it's not just this one event. It's been happening sporadically here and there, in regards to the past few years. And high averages are not new, as far as the tournament. I think Mike Albee had he averaged like 250. If I may be wrong, but it was a 95 Peoria Open, if I remember correctly. In Albee, I think for 42 games, averaged 250. I think D'Entremont ended up winning that, if I remember correctly. But so I mean, talking about 30 years ago, and Mike Albee, led everyone with a 250 average for 42 games. So high scores are not new. It's just this particular event was seriously out of control, and this year is out of control also. So anyways, so that's that's what they're talking about for scoring. We'll see what else they have to
I
say
would
about
really
scoring.
like to hear the opinion of some players on this. That's who I would really like to hear from on this.
You're not going to hear that. You're just not going to hear them publicly stating, like, hey, you know, we gotta check our scoring because this is not reality. But you're just not going to hear that. You know, maybe in the paddock or, you know, at the bar or wherever, you know, maybe some of the pros will say something, or, you know, they won't say it publicly. You know, they're definitely not going to go on YouTube or go on, you know, whatever, TikTok, Instagram, you know, Facebook, whatever, or any social media, and say anything negative about the scoring pace. Because two things will happen. They'll get fined by the PBA. That's a certainty if they say any complaints. And possibly, you know, they'll get a phone call from someone, you know, at the, you know, whichever ball company that they're representing. Because all the top guys are with, I believe, I don't have a stat or I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe all the top guys are being paid by the ball companies, you know. So, you know, I could be wrong, but, you know, whatever. So you're not going to hear pros publicly complaining about the scoring pace. They'll say it behind the scenes, and I have talked to a couple of people, and they're chirping about it pretty good, but they won't say it publicly. When I say they're chirping about it, I mean they don't like it. You know, they really don't like it. You know, so this is something that you're really not going to see, you know, from the pros as far as their true opinion on what the scoring pace has been, especially this year.
I've seen some comments on social media here and there, but nothing too strong. Um, Speaking from my own perspective, I don't really like it. I'm not a fan of it. I don't like it when I turn it to check the scores after a qualifying block and 235 is halfway down the list and you're out of the number by a mile, averaging 235. I mean, to me, that's where I think it gets a little bit silly. Um, you know, I understand how good these guys are. I understand that I'm not in any way saying that the lanes are that easy. Uh, but I am saying that with players of this skill level, I would prefer environments that are challenging them at the highest levels in the hardest ways possible and kind of controlling that scoring environment through that. I don't mind a score fest.
I like the way Big Mike put that. You know, they should be challenged. They are at the highest level of the sport. They should be challenged, and they should want that challenge, and they should demand that. I mean, quite frankly, they should demand that. But that's not what's happening.
Once in a while. I think that this year it's been a little bit over the line, I would say, in terms of the consistency. Rob, thoughts?
I've always liked where the scoring pace, personally, like the higher end on the top 5 to top 10 would be around the high 220s, and the cut averaging maybe in like the high teens. Like I kind of like seeing the scores. I think that's, in my opinion, kind of a little bit of a sweet spot for the regular tour style.
I mean, my opinion on manufacturing scores, I'm not really a fan of manufacturing a score in regards to like, well, hey, we want the cut to be 215 average. We want TV finals to be 218. I'm not really a fan of trying to manage a scoring pace at that level. I'm a big believer in, you know, whatever the practice session is, whatever you put out there, just stay with it. You know, I think that when you try and tweak it as the week goes along, I think you can have a lot of issues when you're trying to tweak a pattern as the week goes on. You know what? You know, and if you make a mistake, you know, you just got to learn. You know, if whatever lane maintenance, you know, if they make a mistake and they put out a pattern that's just, you know, for whatever reason, it's unplayable, you know, from a certain perspective. You know, if you're a boomer or if you throw it straight or you're left-handed or right-handed, you know, if you make a mistake, you just got to learn from it. You know, I mean, being an all lefty show is not new, to this era. We've seen that in other eras, or on the other side, all righty show, which happens quite often because there's more righties. But then you'll see the top 24 or the top finishers or whatever, and you don't see a lefty, in the, anywhere near the top. I believe that we're at the stage with our technology in regards to, lane maintenance, topography, and just understanding how lanes break down. We're well beyond that stage of like, well, hey, I didn't know this was going to happen. We're well beyond that. They should be able to figure this out. To me, I think that this past year, what we've seen so far on the tour, I think this is very much intentional in regards to the scoring pace. Is it tied to the CW network? Could be. Who knows? But this is out of control.
Obviously, the majors, I'd like to see them a lot harder. The majors, I think the U.S. Open and the Masters specifically, I think need to be a lot lower than that.
Yeah, I agree with, Brooklyn Rob here, on the U.S. Open. I don't necessarily know the history of scoring pace on the Masters, but the Masters to me was never an event that was supposed to be similar to what the U.S. Open was supposed to be. That's my opinion, and but it's my opinion is not really based on a ton of fact or a ton of opinion. So again, I don't think that the Masters was ever really considered a low scoring environment.
Just because obviously those are the hardest tournaments, and you want to keep them that way. This scoring pace, though, I'll tell you one thing though: the bowling ball companies absolutely love it. They love when the scores are this high. Do you know how many videos I saw on the bowling ball company's social media of their pros throwing 300s with their bowling balls? They eat that up and they love it. I personally want to just make one thing clear. I see a lot of people on the internet talking about how this was a house shot. And well, let's be clear, this is not a house shot. Maybe to the pros, it seems like a house shot because they're so good and they just know how to make it look like a house shot. But take one shot, for example, oh man, I completely lost my train of thought of who threw the washout, who looked, Vi. Right. Look what happened. Like if that was a house shot and Vi made that shot and he missed right, that ball would have came back and either went through the nose or struck. But he missed right and he left a big, he 4 count, right? So you did still have to make shots. Like it wasn't like you just had to be a certain area of the lane and you still had to be good. I mean, there were still some pros who went minus, and we'll talk about that probably with dumpster diving. So it's just like, hey, like it's yeah, but Mike, like 250, 255 average, like for 30 something games to lead a tournament, like that's just nuts. Like that is a lot of strikes. That's missing like twice, 2 to 3 times a game.
So yeah, I think you kind of understand, the two key points here. What I was trying to bring up, about scoring and pros complaining about it. They are behind the scenes. They don't like it. So, I remember back when I was bowling, and one of the tournaments that we looked forward to because it was one of our bigger events, on the West Coast. It was the it was a combined regional event at Showboat, and for whatever reason, I don't remember what the lane maintenance process was, but it was generally regarded as a higher scoring event, and we just accepted it. We didn't have too much to say about it. At least on the Western region, for me, quite often, we would have full fields, whatever, 142 or 128, whatever it was. we would have full fields, and quite often, the patterns, what we saw, it was negative to make the top 16. And so every once in a while, yeah, we'd see some easier patterns and, go out to Showboat, once a year. And, I think some of the events in Hawaii were higher scoring. I never did make that trip out to Hawaii. It just really financially just really didn't make sense for me at that point in my life. It was, I think it was like 1,800 for first place, and I think there's 3 events, and so you basically had to, you had to make finals every event, which was difficult at the time. 128 bowlers or whatever it was, and 16 spots to make the finals. Cashing in a regional is not breaking even. But anyways, I'm kind of getting off the point here. So I'm going to advance forward here. This is in regards to some of the lefties that were performing during this event. So hopefully I got this timestamp queued up properly.
And hitting me up for betting advice during this telecast today, and I was right the first game, and I was right the second game, just on the odds than anything. And then we
Robarge in the over didn't hit on the Vi match.
Or no, maybe we went Robarge and under them, or whatever it was. We hit the first 2 matches.
Okay.
And then the third match, I text my guy and I said to him, I said, listen, Robarge looks really good, but Packy has to win this match.
Yeah, so basically this is a lefty on lefty match, the third match of this TV finals. Spencer Robarge and Packy Hannaran, or Patrick is first name. But anyways, this particular match, I felt that this is where Packy needed to assert himself as far as thinking that he was. I know that he probably feels, I'm just kind of guessing a little bit, I probably feels that he's the top lefty on tour right now. Jesper, obviously he's got a lot of titles, and he's done very well, for his career. But Packy coming up, I'm sure he feels that he's the top lefty on tour. And this was his opportunity to assert himself. And that didn't happen. Spencer beat him. And, I think that what we just saw right now, and not even that Spencer won, beat Ryan Barnes, but what we just saw right now was changing of the guard. Because I tell you what, that kid Spencer, he's the best lefty on tour right now. Yeah, you can talk about Jesper and, with that Graham Faw. There's no other lefty that's even, even in that range where Spencer's at. I'm not going to say he's head and shoulders above, Packy and Jesper. But I think after this TV show and what we saw, he's the best lefty on tour. And that's going to be proven out over the next 5 to 10 years. And it's, to me, I just don't think that Packy has the game. I mean, obviously he does a lot of things right. Spencer just has a certain approach to the game that I believe that we're going to recognize, somewhere in the range of where Jason Couch, what was that? Obviously if we talk about power players, I think Jason Couch has to be in that discussion as far as great lefties on tour, within that range of power. Parker, of course, and of course we got Earl Anthony, but that's a whole different era, so we can't really compare what Earl did, and maybe a little bit of what Mike Albee did. I mean, Mike Albee had the touch of what Earl had, kind of going up, and Parker, Parker just had had a game that really didn't break down on him, and so he made a lot of shows and had a lot of titles. And what Jason did, I think that what we're seeing out of Spencer is basically the next, probably the next Jason Couch, probably then could be the next Parker Bone, depending on if there's anyone out there that's going to challenge him. I just don't, yes, Jesper has the titles, but I think Spencer is just is considerably better, than what Jesper is, and Packy is just going to be playing catch up, and he's just going to have to find his spots, and he's just going to have to execute in those spots. But I think that what we just saw right now is changing of the guard in regards to the left side.
Packy has to win this match because he's the more experienced player. It's a lefty environment. Okay. I felt like he had to win this match, and you can't let a rookie come in and beat you in that match. You got to get there. And to be honest, I just don't think you could say that perhaps he started with the wrong ball, because I believe he switched balls in the middle of the game, if I'm right, and it seemed like he liked what he switched to a lot better than what he was using. I didn't really think he bowled his best game. I just don't feel like he bowled his best game. He just did. There were quite a few shots that seemed like they needed to be further left. You knew you were going to need a big number, and I just don't feel like he brought what he needed to bring in that situation.
I'm relying on you because I literally fell asleep on the couch during this Packy Spencer match. I woke up in the 9th frame and the match was over. I mean, on top of still not feeling great, the show as a whole felt flat.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with Brooklyn Rob, on this. I thought the show was fine. That's just my opinion. I was interested in all the matches because looking at it from my perspective, of course, EJ's run, the last 2 games, to get into the show, that was pretty fun. I think it's getting, Spencer up there. I watched Spencer a little bit here and there, and of course, based on what I just said, I'm pretty impressed with what he brings to the table or brings to the lanes, whatever. So I don't know, even the Spencer and Spencer and Packy match, I mean, I was interested, but that's also from my perspective, maybe from a casual viewer standpoint, maybe that's where, I'm not saying that, Rob is a casual viewer. I'm just saying that maybe his point is valid to where a casual viewer didn't really find the match interesting. I found it interesting because I know that Spencer's on, I know what his trajectory is, and I think we're on the verge of seeing something special.
Very uninteresting. The players weren't really showing any kind of emotion. It just was real flat until the last match, until the Barnes Robarge match, which was to me the best match of the show, the most interesting, because of the fact where you have 2 rookies, don't have titles, college roommates. There was some story there, and you want to see how Ryan performed in number 1 seed because he's had history of not performing well on TV. So you want to see when he's going to be able to conquer the demons. But yeah, and obviously I'm going to rely on you that Packy didn't obviously have the right ball in his hand.
Yeah, well, it's a shame he fell asleep during that match. Packy actually tried to get the crowd going. He tried to get the crowd into it. He was doing his thing where the crowd was making noise while he was whatnot. And it didn't work out for him. Things didn't go his way. I actually think that could kind of be an interesting quote unquote gamesmanship strategy by him, like, switching the vibe of the show whenever he comes on, and trying, kind of rattling the other player with all this noise going on. It makes it seem like it makes it seem as if the crowd is on his side, right? So yeah,
he's got to strike too. He's got to execute too.
You're right. You're right. Other people could go to the other side and question, like, if that creates an environment that puts too much on him, right, and affects what he's doing and his execution in some way.
All right. Well, anyways, I think we kind of get to the point, as far as or at least my point is that I think we're on the left side. We're seeing changing of the guard here. So I'm going to advance forward here. This is when they're talking about Barnes and, Ryan Barnes and, about his performance on, that final match. So at least if I can't get this forward here. I think this is pretty close.
Last shot where the title was on the line.
Would it be safe to say that
there's that too, to not and yeah, listen, and there Ryan Barnes gets up in the 10th with a chance to double, really triple. You're going to need double 9 to win it. And yeah, listen, and this kid's going to win. This kid, there's no doubt. I mean, he throws it too good as a two-hander to not win, and he broke the average record for a qualifying event this week, right? So there's that too. But I'm just calling it as I see it here.
So you can imagine what's coming. This thing. Alluding back to Chris Barnes, and this is his son. Now his son is having some success on the PBA tour, and his son being, in a title match. In an event that he dominated. I don't even think, Ryan had to bowl the last game. Maybe hit a couple of pins, down as far as the last game. I don't know what the numbers worked out to be, but it was, he performed very well during the week. And, so what they're going to be getting to is, not performing in the 10th. Yeah.
He did not make his best shot in that last shot where the title was on the line.
Would it be safe to say that he gagged? He choked?
No.
I don't know. I think if, because, Ryan went up through the first strike and it looked, to me, watching that first ball, that he executed exactly what he wanted to do. But I'm not behind the lane, so I can't really see his lay down. I can't really see exactly where break point's at. But that first shot, to me, is the most difficult. Because you're sitting down and you're getting up. Because your competitor just went 9th and 10th. The right lane, left lane, and so you're sitting down watching this. A lot of emotions are going through you because he could have been locked out by Spencer. Spencer did not throw a good shot in the first ball in the 10th, whatever, it is what it is, but Spencer did not execute on that first ball in the 10th. So that gave Ryan a chance, and so, and Ryan had a little bit of time to kind of think about it because Spencer had to pick up the spare and, fill ball, whatever. Yeah, I tell you what, in my eyes, Ryan executed that first shot the way it should have been executed. And, so I think the second shot, I didn't, I'm not behind, the settee area. So I can't really see what happened, did his tempo pick up or slow down or whatever? Is it a choke? I don't know. I don't know. I think if you're a pessimist or if you're just, someone that doesn't like Chris Barnes, I think if you're one of those people that just doesn't like Chris Barnes for whatever reason, yeah, you can say his son choked. I don't think so. I think it was just a bad shot. I don't think it was what we would call a traditional choke. You know, to me, a traditional choke is the first ball. Is the first ball in the 10th. Because you're sitting there, you're waiting for the guy to finish out his 10th frame. You got time to think about it, and so many things run through your head. I tell you what, Ryan executed that first shot. So I just don't feel that this is kind of that lame argument. The Chris Barnes struggling on TV early in his career. To me, I've always felt that was a lame argument. Barnes should have been on Chris Barnes should have been on tour when he was 18. The PBA screwed that one up really bad. They should have found ways to get Chris Barnes on tour when he was 18 or 19. The PBA should have found a way to get him on tour. But that's history and whatever. My opinion is that if Chris Barnes would have been on tour, at that age of 18 or 19, we would have saw something, more special than what Chris has already, has or did in his career. But anyways, that's history, and it is what it is. But again, back to my point, if you're not a fan of Chris Barnes, yeah, you're going to say his kid choked. I don't agree, and I just don't agree. I think that missing in the 11th. I don't know what happened. He just didn't execute the shot. I don't think it's the same as just choking off a shot, which we've seen, so many times. First ball in the 10th, where the guy is not even near the head pin or just not even near the pocket. So, anyways, I'm not really a fan of this dialogue, for whatever reason, because I just don't think that the people that are critical of Chris Barnes, they're going to be critical of Ryan. With that, the people critical of Chris, to me, they just don't know bowling.
That's a strong word.
You don't think he choked?
That's a strong word. It's a strong word. That's a strong word.
I don't know, Mike. He was averaging all these high 250s, and he had a really good shot, and it seemed like he had a lot of room right to miss. And he got up in his second shot, and you expect him to at least hit the.
I don't know. I don't agree with Rob on this. Yeah, certainly during qualifying, there wasn't really any match play. It was all basically qualifying. That environment's completely different, than being on the show, and not from a, like, hey, one shot to win the title standpoint, but I'm just saying from a rhythm standpoint, it's just different. It's saying that, oh, he averaged 250 during qualifying should translate into him, Ryan executing in the 11th frame. I don't think that's a fair point. I just don't.
Pocket there, right?
Oh, another thing, whatever that pattern was, they even brought it up early in the show about Chris Vi missing to the right, and he didn't miss to the right by too much. Maybe he pushed it early and just kind of crossed the front a little fast, and whatever happened to Chris, on that one errant shot. I don't think that Ryan had that same type of hang, and so maybe he did. Obviously I didn't bowl on the pattern, but I can understand why maybe there might have been some hesitation, but I don't think that played in. I just think that Ryan just didn't execute, in plain and simple. But averaging 250 during qualifying has nothing to do with that 11th shot.
How do you not call that a gag?
I'm surprised at the scoring pace of the last game.
How do you not call it a choke, though? Let's call a spade a spade. I love Ryan. I agree with all the sentiments that you say about how this kid's going to win a lot of titles, and it wouldn't surprise me if he goes into the Hall of Fame one day, years from now. But, you kind of, I would be surprised if you even asked him and he said he did it. Like,
man, I mean, listen, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not disagreeing with you. I think it's to me it might be a tad harsh just because, first of all, it was a tough situation. You got to get up and go double 9, right? It's not like he needed one.
he threw the first one.
He threw the first one pretty good, and yeah, I mean it's it's tough situation. There's a lot on the line there, So Spencer Robarsh, not surprised. I mean,
no,
they mentioned it on the show. Like this kid has been a name in bowling since he was like a teenager.
Yeah, that's the future right there. I think we're going to see something special, out of Spencer. But anyways, I'm going to wrap this up. I had some other stuff to cover, but this has gotten to be a video. It's a little bit longer than what I thought. So anyways, I enjoy the content that these guys put out. I just thought I'd kind of give my 2 cents, and let's talk bowling, and let's find ways to to have these conversations, and beyond that, let's find ways to promote the sport of bowling. Take care, and I'll see you guys on the flip.